So we continue our we continue, and in this video we solve we'll solve the quiz number. We start from the quiz number 5, okay, as we solve it from 1 till 4 in the previous lecture. Now, given the function f of x equal to x multiplied by exponential of x squared plus 1, then we have some possibilities. Okay, before solving such a quiz, such MCQ, I would like to let's say I would like to highlight some properties, something about the derivatives, the primitives. So suppose you have a function. Suppose you have a function f of x, okay, and suppose that big F of x, okay, suppose that big F of x is a primitive. It's a primitive for capital F of x, okay. What I am claiming is that, so if you have f of x and you have one primitive that is big F of x, okay, what I'm going to say is that if you have any other function g of x equal to f of x plus some constant, okay, so if you take any other function that is g of x plus a number, this c is any number, okay, then such g of x will also be a okay, then g of x is also a new primitive of f of x. It's also a new primitive for f of x, okay. Now my question, so we understand, the question is that now we all, furthermore, this is not only an if, it is also, so these are all the possible type of primitive that you can have. So not only g of x is a primitive, but all the possible primitive will have this form, will have this form. So when you already know one primitive, all the other primitives differ from that one just from a constant. So given a form, it's sufficient to know one primitive, then we will know all the other one, because all the other primitive just differ from the first one that you got just from a constant. So what I am saying is that if you have a primitive 1 f of x and you have another primitive 2 which is g of x, anytime you do a primitive minus another primitive, you should get a number, okay. Anytime you subtract two primitive, you should get a number, okay. Nice. This was important to recall. Now let's go back to the MCQ and try to understand, to look at the question. So the question says that you are given the function f of x equal to x squared times exponential of x squared. Let me cancel this. Go to some new. So your f of x equal to x squared, no, x times exponential of x squared, right? Now she say if f of x is capital F of x is a primitive, then g of x equal to this is also a primitive. So what do we know? We know that capital F of x is a primitive, and then he gave of g of x equal to capital F of x minus 3 multiplied by the cosine of the sine square of 2x sine square of 2x plus cosine square of 2x. Now we want to know if this g of x is also a primitive, yes or not. The only way for g of x to be a primitive, it should be another primitive plus a constant. So the only way for me is that all this stuff should be a constant, okay? But you remember that the sine square of any angle plus the cosine square of the same angle always gives 1. No. The cosine square of an angle plus its sine square always give 1. Okay? This is from trigonometry from high school. So this means that basically g of x that they gave to you is just f of x minus 3. And so I proved that f of x plus minus 3, right? So it is f of x plus a constant. So I proved that this g of x is equal to f of x plus a constant. So g of x is also a primitive. Okay, because we said that if we add a constant to a primitive, we get a new primitive. Nice. So A is correct. Okay. So the answer is actually 5A. But as usual, you know that my way of solving the MCQ is not just to give you the correct one. This is not the idea of this channel. The idea is to not just to solve the MCQ, but to explain you why the order are false, in such that it helps you in solving other MCQs. Okay, one of its primitive is g of x equal to this. So let's go and find all the possible primitive of this function. Excuse me, the function was plus 1. There was plus 1 here. Okay, but it doesn't change the. So what is the primitive here? So we will get that the primitive is the integral of x multiplied by exponential of x squared plus 1 all in dx, right? Now another important formula for integration is the integral of f prime times exponential of f. It's always exponential of f. Yes or not? These are formulas that you should know. So turning back, this integral split at integral of x multiplied by exponential of x squared plus the integral of 1 in dx, right? Let me put the dx here. Questions? Now I can write it like 1/2 integral of x exponential of x squared in dx plus integral of 1 in dx. So here I multiply by 2 and I divide by 2. Why I did it? Because now this become f prime exponential of f. Doubts? So this become f prime exponential of f. Now so the integral will give me 1/2 exponential of x squared, because this will be exponential of x squared plus x plus c. So this is the general form of the primitives, right? But the guy is telling me here that the primitive should have x here, which is false. Look at what he said, it's false. There exists primitive of f of x that are not defined on R. When you look at all these possible primitive, the domain of all this f is R. Yes or not? The domain is R. There is no conditions. There is nothing to exclude. By the way, if you understand a bit about Italian, also on the channel, on this channel, there is a video about the how to compute the domain of a function. But in the next days, I will also put I will put it in English. Okay. So there exists a primitive of f of x that is not defined on it. That is not defined on R. We saw that all the primitives are defined on R. H of x equal to 1/2 x times exponential of x squared plus x, then h prime. So he's saying that this h of x is a possible primitive, but it's not the case because it has this x here. And finally, he says that if g of x equal to this, if g of x is equal to this, then g prime of x is equal to f of x. Also, this one is false because this g of x is not a primitive. There is no x square in the in what we get. Okay, so let's solve the quiz number 6. So I repeat that the answer here was A. Okay, nice. Quiz number 6. You are given the function f of x equal to sine square x multiplied by the cosine of x, a primitive of f of x passing through this point. So we don't want all the primitive, but we want the primitive that pass through this point. Okay, is so first let's find all the primitive, then we'll find. So the function is f of x equal to sine square of x multiplied by the cosine of x, right? So it is to go and find some f of x, it should be integral of let me write cos x multiplied by sine square of x. Is the same thing, right? Is there any doubt? Okay, so now you will probably remember that the cosine is the derivative of the sine. So I am integrating f prime multiplied by f square. Okay, please guys, I can't hear you. Can you please I can't hear you. Can you check your microphone? Yes, now yes. Is there a question? Yes. That means that this will just be f to power 3 over 3. So it will be, this integral will be sine cube of x over 3 plus c, right? Now these are all the possible derivatives, the possible primitives. What means that this primitive pass through these points? The primitive pass through this point, it means that if we put x to pi over 6, the function will give 1. Okay, so it means that the primitive pass through that point means that f of pi over 6 is 1. Okay, it means that sine cube of pi over 6 divided by 3 is 1. No, plus c is 1, right? But sine cube of pi over 6 means sine of pi over 6, so sine cube of pi over 6 will be 1/2 cube divided by 3 plus c is 1. Okay, so 1/2 cube is 1 over 8 divided by 3 plus c is 1. So this is 1 over 24 plus c equal 1. So c equal to 1 minus 1 over 24 equal to 23 over 24. Okay, so c is 23 over 24, and thus the primitive that we are looking for is f of x equal to sine cube of x over 3 plus 23 over 24. Going back here, we can see that the answer is D. Okay, so we get 6D. Nice. So we conclude also this recording section here, this video here, and we'll proceed with the solution of the MCQ in the next video. Keep in mind that you can write any the comments, your comment in the comment section, and as soon as possible I will answer if there is any question. Furthermore, I invite you to subscribe to the channel in order to be updated about new videos and other stuff. Thanks.